It's not all fun and games here on NES Works. Sometimes it's movies, too.
That voice, little fella, that a baritone or a tenor? Oh,
Something a little different this episode. It's not a game, it's not a console, it's not an accessory. Nevertheless, it's something essential to the history of the Nintendo Entertainment System. Yes, it's the motion picture masterpiece, The Wizard. Perhaps I'm overplaying my hand here with the sarcasm. The Wizard is not by any stretch of the imagination a masterpiece. It's not a terrible movie, though. The Wizard is very much a mediocre family drama of the type you often saw in the 1980s, where a low-stakes plot hinges on unlikely coincidences and some sort of improbable theme. Above all else, The Wizard existed to sell Nintendo games. And I have to hand it to The Wizard. Of all the Nintendo commercials produced in the late 1980s, this was certainly the most grandiose. The existence of The Wizard speaks to the evolving mediascape of the 1980s. It was by no means the first movie about video games and gaming culture. Even discounting something like Tron, a film that used computers and game avatars as substitutes for outer space and spaceships, or Cloak and Dagger, a film in which video games functioned as little more than a MacGuffin. Video game fandom had been the focus of movies before. I'm specifically thinking of 1983's Joysticks, an equally pedestrian film that revolved around young people with a video game obsession of their own. But that was a very different kind of movie than The Wizard, an attempt to tap into the horny teen culture sleeper cell that had been activated by Porky's. The Wizard sets its sights younger, focusing on a couple of tweens rather than college-aged teens. It features 100% fewer naked boobs and smutty jokes than Joysticks, and the raciest it ever gets is a chaste kiss between Fred Savage and Ginny Lewis that's halfway played for laughs. All of this speaks to how the American gaming landscape had changed over the course of the 1980s following the Atari crash. In the early 80s, arcades ruled all, and arcades were primarily frequented by older kids who had access to cars and just wanted somewhere to hang out before heading out to the woods to shotgun illegally acquired beer or whatever. By 1989, arcades still existed, but the dominant force in gaming in America was the NES, a game console mostly played by kids who couldn't get to the arcades without mom to drive them there. And the only amber liquids they wanted was 7-Up Gold, not Bud Light. The youth-oriented nature of The Wizard also speaks to the way the overall media landscape had transformed over the course of the 1980s. Back in the Strider episode, I touched on the fact that the deregulation of the Federal Communications Commission back in the early days of Reagan's first term opened up the floodgates for corporations to target children directly with advertising. This had the result of leading to more television and film catering to kids than had existed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And generally, the kids' fare that showed up here was of better quality than in previous decades. Corporations had more to gain from successfully deployed shows like He-Man or the Transformers, so they invested more funding into the creation of those shows. Even something like DuckTales ultimately had something to sell to kids. And damn, what a great series of commercials that was. This leads us to The Wizard, which, despite its title and its picaresque story, really has nothing much to do with The Wiz or The Wizard of Oz. No, this is a Rain Man-alike. Actually, it was pitched to Nintendo by Universal Pictures as a riff on The Who's Tommy, but it ended up as something of a reframing of the 1988 Tom Cruise-Dustin Hoffman blockbuster as a light fantasy road trip for kids that revolves around Nintendo games and leads to, why, it leads to Universal Pictures' very own theme park. Imagine that. And there's no reason for any of us to get defensive about succumbing to this trend. You, the adult who grew up with Nintendo and have willingly subjected yourself to this nostalgia bait video about a movie that wanted to sell you a copy of Super Mario Bros. 3 when it hit the stores a few months later, well, you're a victim here too, my friend. The thing about this integrated advertising strategy is that it worked. I mean, look at the recent promotional campaign for the 40th anniversary reissue of Transformers the Movie, which centers around an apology to former children for killing Optimus Prime so that those kids would replace their Optimus figures with a shiny new Ultra Magnus or Rodimus Prime. The Wizard was very much intended as a commercial for the NES and its games. It came about as an attempt to capitalize on the fact that Nintendo's chip shortage in 1988 resulted in a series of knock-on delays that pushed Super Mario Bros. 3 from 1988 into 1990. Everyone in this film is absolutely obsessed with Nintendo. If they don't start out that way, they come around to see the light of its greatness by the time the credits roll. The Wizard takes place in a world where arcades exist, but the only machines that people play are PlayChoice 10 systems. This is pretty funny because the PlayChoice 10 also existed as a promotional tool for NES games. They let kids sample actual NES ROMs for about 3 minutes per coin. This film is commercials all the way down. Again, the premise comes straight from Rain Man. The point of view character, here played by Savage, recognizes that his brother has amazing skills at NES games, despite seemingly being on the spectrum. Yes, it's a landmark pioneer in the problematic autism as a superpower genre. That's not great, but at least the Wizard has some subtlety about it. There are surprisingly zero casual slurs tossed around, despite this being an 80s movie, and Jimmy the young gaming savant's aphasia is eventually revealed to be the result of his trauma and depression over losing his younger sister. And unlike in Rain Man, his older brother Corey only kind of exploits Jimmy's skills for his own benefit. Mostly, Corey just wants to keep his little brother from being institutionalized and help get to the bottom of his fixation on going to California, and using Jimmy as a ringer in video game wagers against paunchy businessmen who really love PlayChoice 10 is simply a means to that end. Luckily for Corey and Jimmy, there just so happens to be a massive video game contest taking place in a few days at Universal City in California. So they both run away and attempt to make their way across the dusty American Southwest with a backpack full of snacks and $4 to their name. Yes, this was a different time when the American dollar went a lot further, and the mere suggestion of molesting an underage girl could have real consequences for sleazy old men.
He touched my breast!
It was, above all, a time in which Nintendo had risen to dominance in youth culture across America, and the company sought to quickly bring their marketing machine up to speed with the impressive media ecosystem that had evolved in Japan over the previous 5 or 6 years. Once again, we see the disruptive effect that the Atari crash had on the North American console sales machine. There had been a pretty expansive culture of tie-in media to video games during the early arcade and Atari 2600 era here. Not just tangential works like joysticks and Tron, but magazines, books, and of course a succession of cartoons like Saturday Supercade that directly adapted video game properties into animation. The console market's implosion wiped all of those ventures off the face of the earth, and it took until 1989 or so for the gears of capitalism to fully grind into action once again to exploit children's love of NES games. The Wizard was only one facet of the blanket assault of video game-related goods that film, television, print, and toy companies hit the US market with over the course of the year, establishing a permanent new ancillary product focus that's running stronger than ever here in 2026. But since Japan never had a crash of that variety, despite the best or worst attempts of third-party publishers peddling substandard Famicom games, the Japanese market was way ahead of the US at making money off of kids by appealing to their love of Nintendo. Once again, I credit Tokuma Shoten's How to Win at Super Mario Bros. For really kicking things off. That video game strategy guide was the best-selling book in Japan for the year of its release. Not the best-selling guidebook, the best-selling book, period. So yeah, a deluge of media and merchandise followed immediately in its wake. Nintendo commissioned a Super Mario Bros. Anime in 1986, the odd but mostly pretty okay Peach Hime Kyushutsu Daisakusen, and tons of game cartoons followed, running the gamut from Adventure Island to Life Force. Game magazines went big at that point too. Famitsu debuted as a login magazine feature in 1985, before splitting into its own weekly publication the following year, competing against the likes of Family Magazine to bring kids the hottest, coolest information on Famicom games. To my thinking, the real inflection point for the Wizard came in 1988, when several games-focused video magazines debuted in Japan. 2 competing VHS-based magazines launched that year, the hype machine that was Famimaga Video and the much stranger GameTech Video. I'll put together a guide-in episode on those publications someday, but Japanese VHS magazines struck upon an interesting value proposition. A magazine format that allowed kids to see the latest games in action, Instead of trying to parse what Dragon Quest III and the Mega Drive launch lineups would play like based on smeary little screenshots, VHS magazines demonstrated their reality with actual footage accompanied by commentary. I guess that doesn't seem like such a big deal today when you're here on YouTube, a platform that grants you infinite access to 4K footage of upcoming games and allows you to watch live playthroughs of new releases while computer-animated schoolgirl avatars share their thoughts on the action in real time. But terms like 4K UHD, VTuber, and livestream didn't exist 40 years ago, and we had to make do with grainy, off-screen photos once a month in order to get our fix of gaming hype. Enter the VHS Game Magazine. Now, this publication concept never launched an equivalent here in the US, probably for reasons of mere sanity. These tapes can't have been cheap to produce, and distribution in the US is much more difficult than in tiny Japan or the UK, and Americans are notoriously stingy. We'd maybe pay $3.95 for a thick, full-color magazine once a month, but $19.99 for a monthly videotape? I could have bought you 20 sandwiches in the Arby's 5 for 5 promotion. Now, Game Players magazine did glom onto this trend, kind of. Rather than publishing a monthly VHS equivalent to that print periodical, though, Signal Publishing instead cemented the term game tapes into the nerd lexicon with a series of VHS cassettes focused on beating games. The Game Players Game Tape. Essentially, video walkthroughs for the hottest games. And Thundercade for some reason. The Game Players Game Tape line ran for more than a dozen installments before petering out. But while these offered a much more effective demonstration of how to struggle through something like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or RoboCop for NES than a print walkthrough could, they were intended as supplements for games that kids already owned. The game tapes did very little to showcase upcoming releases, one of the key selling points of games-related media. It would be a few years before Nintendo Power would begin sending out VHS tapes to subscribers in order to hype up big first-party titles like Star Fox, which means that the US gaming fanbase had fallen desperately behind their Japanese counterparts. The video game video preview gap seemed insurmountable. And that's where the wizard comes into the scene. There is a story about a family here, but it mostly exists in service of hyping up Mario. Spoilers here. Ultimately, Jimmy turns out to be obsessed with California because it's the last place he spent time with his family before his baby sister died and his parents split apart. But the wizard relegates the resolution of Jimmy's tale and the healing of his PTSD-induced catatonia to the movie's denouement, making it a secondary consideration to the real climax of the film, Jimmy getting to play Super Mario Bros. 3 a few months before anyone else in the US and completely demolishing everyone else in a live competition by figuring out the game's secrets on the fly. I think it would be a little too cynical to write off Jimmy's tale and his journey with Corey and the cool runaway teenage girl they meet along the way as a mere framing device for Nintendo promotion, but only just. The Wizard is a massive advertisement for the NES and some of its biggest releases circa summer 1989, when the movie was filmed. The Southwest is, again, absolutely rotten with arcades in which the only working machine is a PlayChoice 10. Well, except for that one curious machine that has the marquee for Capcom's F1 Dream, but actually plays Taito's Top Speed. You can judge the moral alignment of every character in the film based on their relationship with video games. Jimmy and his goofball father are the purest of heart and absolutely obsess over NES games. Corey and his runaway crush, Haley, both like games, but they lack the intensity of Jimmy's fervor. Cool older kid Lucas, who wears a black trench coat in the Arizona summer heat in order to accessorate the power glove that he transports in a military-grade Halliburton case, is an antagonist, but ultimately not evil. He too loves video games, only without the idealistic purity of Jimmy. Even Jimmy's oldest brother, the cynical Nick, enjoys video games, even if he feels that they are beneath him, and that his father's obsession with mastering TMNT is pretty weird. Actually, I'll give him that. Trying to master TMNT for NES is pretty weird. Really, the only major character who doesn't love video games is Putnam, the true villain of the piece. He's a real piece of work, a bounty hunter hired to find the runaway Jimmy and take him back to his family, but who actively works to prevent Jimmy's dad from finding Jimmy in order to ensure that he lands his bounty. Of course, you can tell that Putnam sucks because they cast him as a short, middle-aged man with glasses and a receding hairline. And truly, is there anything more contemptible than a short, middle-aged man with glasses and a receding hairline. Make no mistake, this is a commercial for the NES that devotes a significant amount of screen time to hard rockin' montages of people playing TMNT and Ninja Gaiden, with occasional splashes of Mega Man 2, the hottest NES games at the time the Wizard was filmed, June of 1989. It presents the Power Glove as a heroic piece of virtual reality gear, showcasing one of the few genuinely valuable use cases for the peripheral in Rad Racer. It turns an unnamed Nintendo Power phone line consultant into the secret hero of the adventure, as he shares tips so that Hallie can shout them out to Jimmy in the heat of his eventual video game showdown against Lucas. And it culminates in that all-important, real-time first look at Super Mario Bros. 3, a game slated for US release a couple of months after The Wizard began its theatrical run. I cannot overstate the degree to which this defines The Wizard as, really, a piece of Super Mario Bros. 3 promotional material. Nintendo went all in on hyping that game's release, saturating the airwaves with commercials for it, dedicating an entire issue of Nintendo Power to it, broadcasting a Super Mario-themed cartoon by Deke Animation with bookend segments talking it up, even releasing PlayChoice 10 ROMs of it into circulation months ahead of the cartridge launch in order to whet fans' appetites. The Wizard is the highest profile part of that massive multimedia onslaught. It had a multi-million-dollar budget, a wide US theatrical release, and starred some pretty big names at the time, not only Savage, but also Beau Bridges and Christian Slater. And you know, it's not the worst movie ever. By the standards of 1989, it's solidly middling. A basic, predictable, by-the-numbers genre picture. It took a critical drubbing, not without justification, for existing as a Trojan horse for Nintendo games. When the emotional climax of your movie hangs on a video game preview rather than the deuteragonist finding the personal catharsis he needs to heal his trauma, you've done something terribly wrong. But there is a pretty respectable, heartfelt, emotional core here. The Wizard is very much a product of its time that almost manages to explore the impact of loss and divorce on children. Despite the circumstances that split the Wood household, the family members still care for each other, and each tries to make the best choices for one another. The characters all exist as cliches, from the father's proto-Ray Romano schlubbiness to Haley's whole manic pixie trailer park dream girl thing that turns her poverty into a superpower every bit as spectacular as Jimmy's hyper-fixated catatonia. But there's still something earnest here, buried beneath the commercials and cliches. And also, I gotta say, Super Mario Bros. 3 looks pretty cool. Did you know you can use the secret whistle to warp to World 4? Holy shit! Next time on NES Works, it'll leave you feeling a little arch.